Joining me to discuss ESG today on the Fatboy Show is Wotsomu Wanda, an economist, analyst, and consultant, and also friend of the show, frequent guest. Welcome once again, Wotsomu Wanda, to the Fatboy Show.
I'm so humbled to be here again.
Yeah, good to have you here. You know, whenever we need to explore or discuss issues of serious importance, you are, for me, the number one guy to go to.
That frightens me. Makes me look what? Too serious? At times I need to relax
No, it makes you look wise. Okay. But, earlier I just gave a breakdown of the general ideas about what ESG is and some of its components, but maybe you can tell us what you yourself think or why you think ESG has gained significant attention in recent years.
Yes, basically what you've gone through was a wonderful summary of what we have as ESG today. It has become one of the most prominent ideas that has been pushed forward. At times you wonder whether it's a fad that will, run off at some point, but it's something that is becoming persistent, that we are going to stages where they are even considering frameworks that are coming before anyone can think of metrics to determine the specifics or the technical specifics of what ESG actually will entail.
And it's interesting how, one of the benchmarks they look at is accountability and transparency, or at least in the scope of governance. This is what they demand of companies, while they themselves, or the authors of these, the people who create these ideas about ESG, are themselves not transparent about how they arrive at these initiatives and whether or not they can be universally applicable. I don't think, given the cultural diversity of the human race, that it's a one-size-fits-all situation. Is there not the same risk of neocolonialism, where America will invade Iraq because we need to give them democracy, whereas in a country like Iraq, whereas it may sound like a novel idea, perhaps culturally there's different forces at play that might lend itself to a more unique political organization.
Yes, basically when you indicate that it's a wide-ranging and more or less amorphous and actually not transparent way of trying to look at companies or the public space for that matter, it becomes a bit complicated because the wide array of factors that have to be captured within ESG is daunting to begin with. If a company was going to start functioning in a way that it considers all these particular aspects, to start with, without metrics, to add on to their EBITDA, their traditional accounting principles they have to follow, well, it's debilitating to a company performing in any way.
Well, I could be wrong, but it almost sounds like the only metrics that matter is more is better. So in other words, the more you comply, the more points you get on your ESG score, and perhaps this pushes you up the ladder when it comes to potential access to investment capital and things of that nature.
Yeah, but
is there a limit to where they say, okay, company X, you've done enough, we're satisfied?
I don't think that will ever have to happen, because the problem we have with this again is the amorphous nature of the standards or framework with which they want to approach ESG. First of all, when you talk of environmental area of approach on issues, that's why on its own, as an area, it's so deep, it's so scientific to a certain extent. Of course, there's a lot of politics that has come into play with that, but ultimately, there is actual impact, environmental, that is going on today in the world. So when one focuses in that area alone, you will have your hands full with what actually you have to deal with. Then now if you start bringing in things that are social, for that matter, social is really, but it's a matter of perspective.
So, for example, Uganda, as you know, we've been making headlines globally because our president assented to a very controversial bill, the anti-homosexuality bill, which obviously absolutely runs counter to the goals of the ESG.
The S part of it.
Exactly. Which does intend to place great emphasis on LGBT representation.
That's very true.
And celebration in some cases. So obviously that means that, if you are a company operating within Uganda, it's going to be very difficult for you to comply with those requirements. For example, as I mentioned earlier, we are in the month of June 2023. It is Pride Month in Western countries. The whole month is dedicated to celebrating LGBT causes, and corporate companies are seem to be at the forefront of the messaging when it comes to acknowledgement of gay rights. Now, how would such a company, should they have a foothold in a market like this and other socially conservative countries, how can they be expected to meet those standards, whereas these countries are rather hostile to LGBT ideas?
That's a very interesting aspect, because in our own country here, we have a great deal of social approaches to certain issues. Mm-hmm. Some of our biggest companies have been so well ingrained and deeply involved in the social part of it. Mm-hmm. You have MTN with this marathon. During the marathon week, you basically, the whole place is painted yellow.
Right.
And that yellow seems to, in some instances, it was a little bit controversial because of the political way it could come about. But in any case, it ended up having its own brand, its own consistency, mm-hmm. and basically bringing about a relaxed atmosphere that was inclusive to everyone. That's really social. That's really deep. Except
inclusive to one community.
Exactly. Now, that being the case, no one in that participation would feel excluded. Because what MTN was basically promoting in such instances were really fundamental issues that are helpful. Water for Karamoja, pregnant women, funding, things of that nature, which were really social. Which, by the way, that's what has been interesting to me. ESG was what we were previously considering CSR.
Okay.
Yeah.
Although CSR usually just meant building houses for the poor people, painting zebra crossings, donating bed sheets to a hospital.
Exactly. Same thing is happening within that S.
But I guess the issue for me would be there are certain specific niche topics that seem to be at the forefront of the social initiatives that are being pushed by ESG. So, for example, I'll talk about diversity. We are now seeing a lot of companies being encouraged to insert more marginalized people from so-called marginalized groups. More women, more ethnic racial minorities, more sexual minorities, and so forth. Now, it is hard to tell to what extent companies operating within Uganda are sort of subscribe to that model, and to what extent they might be influenced. I know that obviously many of the larger companies here are part of larger multinational global companies.
Yes, that's very true.
For example, most of our banks. I think we have. Is it just one local bank we have?
Yeah.
Or none?
Right now, more or less none, but one.
Right.
A bit local.
Okay, and of course, I'm not too sure about our telecoms, but certainly many our beverage companies are international.
And they're all international. Yeah.
So there does seem to be a degree to which they are attempting to adhere to that. And I wonder if that would then call into question recruitment practices. We are, for example, seeing now more than ever before a lot of women rising to positions of prominence in the corporate world.
That's social.
Now, without trying to take away anything from the efforts of the women who have ascended to these positions, is there not a danger of it being perceived that these are token promotions, token positions being given to these ladies, that these appointments are being made and recruitments on the basis of a push for increased inclusion of women in the corporate space, rather than a strictly meritocratic consideration for who's the best candidate?
Yes, ultimately, pushing some of these ideas, I think, again, on such an issue, Uganda has been at the core of some of these issues. In our political field, we have our women. I don't want to call it tokenism, but they've really been promoted.
At least when it comes to gender, we are fairly progressive.
We have done
in this country.
Exactly. And the same thing happens in the corporate world, where we have seen a lot of our women push forward. But it all started with education, with that extra that they would get at a point of transition into university. There was a little boost for our ladies, and somehow we got a lot of them shifting into university, graduating, and had so many who have participated and then have been able in the corporate world and the rest, and have been able to rise in the ranks. And so we have at least a prominence and appearance of our females participating.
So my concern is only this, that, and my question was, would this not lend some credence to questions some people might ask about the basis of these hirings? Not to say that they're not capable. Certainly, many of them are. I'm just saying, once you make it known that there is such a policy in place and that there is a push for increased inclusion, one has to wonder if he ever encounters whether an ethnic minority in a Western country or a female here in Uganda, that they got the job because they were the best for it. I feel like it places an undue burden on them to prove their worth.
Yeah, what's interesting here is that ultimately, but this is in some cases individualized, you will get ladies who are really good at what they're doing, and you look and really appreciate that, well, we could have missed out such a prominent skill or talent if probably the previous boost hadn't happened. That happens. But at the same time, what can be frightening is having those you find who really don't belong, and they are at the forefront, and you wonder, well, how did this one creep through? That creates problems for those who are hustling and pushing and working hard and being sidelined because of that particular focus and push. So yes, it ultimately, some of these ideas are wonderful when they're initiated, but sometimes they often require sunset periods. You know that, okay, after this period of time, we would have done enough for this particular
I don't think that's how it works.
Yeah, ultimately.
I think it just, people will continue to look for more and more opportunities for, I guess, seeking recourse over redress over social injustices, perceived social injustices. They will always, because now apparently it is wrong to misgender a person. If you ever met a trans woman or a trans man, if you called them a different gender or used a different pronoun, that can land you in a lot of trouble now in many of these Western countries. Now, fortunately, it would seem like in Africa or in Uganda specifically, we're still keeping to the basics. We're not yet veering too far into the more extreme progressive ideas that right now are the topic of much cultural debate in these Western nations.
No, yes, often in a society you need a bit of balance. If one side over rises and pushes their agenda to the extreme, you get extremism, and when we roll into extremism, ultimately the whole society suffers. Ultimately.
Right. So what do you believe are some of the economic or potential benefits and also challenges associated with ESG integration for companies and investors? So let's say I'm previously non-compliant. How hard would it be for me as a company to adopt these ESG initiatives such that I can benefit from some of the things that could come my way?
On the governance front, basically any company that focuses on doing the best job and being transparent on how they approach their work often comes up to the top. There is a lot of gain on the governance front following ESGs. On the environmental front, it's vital that some of the things are adopted. Some of these ideas are vital to survival of society as we know it.
So when you say environmental, would this be restricted to, say, the more manufacturing-oriented industries and companies who would potentially be a contributor to pollution?
Yes.
Like carbon emissions or perhaps river pollution and things of this nature?
Yes, in that sense. That's quite vital. I think some communities, towns, cities, and counties that are on the coastal are really suffering. I think they've started facing real danger with the environmental changes, and the early signs of something happening is really materializing. That they're investing a great deal in the normal things that will come when floods over. I think over a period of time, they're realizing they're investing a lot in flood prevention, which has become prominent. That tells you something has changed.
Okay, so obviously we must be careful about how we are handling our very fragile ecosystem and environment.
That's very true.
But then when pitted against larger economies and larger countries, such as, say, China,
Yes.
who really don't care all that much about this stuff.
No.
They're one of the worst offenders when it comes to pollution.
Yeah, but it has 1 billion people.
Okay, but my point is, so if as a country you force the companies operating within your country to comply with these measures, you would do so while causing them to incur significant costs, because to be environmentally compliant would require companies to make significant investments in perhaps anti-pollution systems, purification systems,
Yes,
things
carbon
of this nature, carbon capture, all this stuff.
Yes.
Whereas a Chinese manufacturer in mainland China doesn't have to worry about this, so that's a cost he doesn't have to sustain. Thus, he can more easily outcompete his Western counterpart,
That's
who
very
is
true.
subjected to those sorts of stringent rules.
Yeah, the stringent rules only apply and should only come in with full government support. Government cannot enforce this and make it impossible for manufacturers or companies to function by insisting on this to protect the environment.
So how do you think they can do that? Like maybe tax?
Yes, tax incentives.
Tax
There have
incentives.
to be subsidies. They have to be specifically targeted. And in any case, I think one of the interesting things with the environmental part of it, and that's why, to me, it's one of the areas that really can do something important, is that some of the technologies that can be introduced to mitigate against environmental pollution and other areas, carbon especially, transform particular companies to become even more efficient. The technologies can be so modern that ultimately they become the next level area of operation. That those who have gone early in some of these technologies find themselves ultimately reaping a lot of returns long term. But the investment part of it has to be hand in hand with government, or otherwise it becomes prohibitive.
Okay, but just on that point, there is a tendency for companies to try to give the appearance of complying with these standards, appearing to, they can put some money aside on really white elephant projects, like on useless ventures, to simply create the impression that they are trying to be ESG compliant. Whereas in actuality, there may not be any real development of any new technology taking place. There's a Michael Moore documentary I watched recently. I don't know if you saw it. He obviously is facing cancellation by his camp. As you know, he's been a very prominent progressive activist, pro-environmentalist, feminist, all this stuff.
Yeah.
And so people were shocked when he put out a documentary in which he was bashing what he and others call, I think, eco-capitalism. Are you familiar with that term?
Yeah, I'm familiar with it, but
so because now there's such attention given to environmental issues and all this, it's given opportunity to scammers to come up with programs alleging to solve an environmental issue or other.
Yes.
So for example, I am a company that is building renewable, roofing tiles or something like this, or solar roofing tiles.
Yes.
And then I will use that to attract all this investment capital. And in the end, all of the materials I would be using to produce these renewable technologies, in fact, ends up causing more pollution. You know the controversy surrounding the cobalt mining. That is required for the batteries for electric cars.
Yes.
So whereas on one hand you are purporting to solve a problem of pollution, but really you've just transferred the pollution elsewhere.
Yeah, that's
and
true.
to a more massive scale.
Yeah, I think what we said earlier when you gave that introduction is the frameworks and metrics to determine ESG are not standard, and they don't yet exist. Like you would have your financial profit and loss income statement. That's quite standard. And what has to come in and out and everyone following step by step and appreciating what you've been doing is quite clear. Nothing is yet clear with ESG. Everyone seems to be approaching it and trying to determine depending on their particular interests. Now, that being the case, you find that what you've indicated is actually happening. H&M, are they all being sued where they are doing what we call greenwashing?
What's that?
Yeah, they have clothing lines
Uh-huh.
that they purport to be more environmental friendly.
But
they are more they are
more inclusive.
Yeah.
They put more friendly labor law, like they
Exactly.
treat their workers well.
organic cotton and for that
Things of
matter.
this nature.
Yeah, recycled
We're buying
polyester.
we're buying from the farmers in
Straight.
Bolivia.
Yeah, with no chemicals involved or whatever, and they're environmental.
And yet-
Ultimately, yes, when they dug a little bit, they found this was pure marketing and it was all hogwash, and they're actually in court. So now the court processes that are being initiated, I think, are also pushing this particular ESG to be prominent, and that's where you brought in that Blackrock and Vanguard being so determined that going forward, while all their portfolio players have to be at least focused on some of these areas, that because they are aware of the avalanche of litigation that is coming forward, focused on the companies that are doing what we are indicating, cutting corners, and those that have done real damage. But this is so much so in oil and gas giant companies. Those ones are actually all in court ultimately.
Who is suing them? Just class action suits?
Yes, they are class action suits. Some of them, Oxfam is at the forefront of some of these. In France, you have so many that are already. That's what our Total was also going through.
Oh yeah.
Yes. So, with these particular activists who are focused with the law groups and are doing class action suits, some of the cases are actually going to the Supreme Court. On the final judgments, there is going to be a danger that we end up in a tobacco kind of legal problem or payouts, especially with oil companies.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so there are so many cases. People have indicated there was an avalanche and an increase of over 25% from the previous year. So that has focused investors and pension funds, because the two areas that invest the most with the deep pockets of investment are hedge funds, Blackrock and the Vanguard as indicated, and then pension funds with their asset managers. So that being, those two on the boards are pushing hard for all the companies they're involved in to focus on these areas. And I think with that, there is then a possibility of clearer frameworks coming through. With clearer frameworks, then we can start at least having real proper areas of focus, and you know that, okay. But otherwise, almost all companies that seem to indicate being ahead of the curve in ESG are basically playing games, one or the other. They are finding ways of, almost all oil companies today, first of all, many of them change their names to try look a little bit more green friendly.
Yes.
Many of them indicate their impact investments are focused on mitigating.
Okay, so for me personally, I lean more on the side of this is all just for appearances, and I guess some of these companies are big enough that they can absorb these rather expensive initiatives that would really cause them to incur heavy costs. You know, if it means hiring a few more people of a certain minority race who may not specifically be qualified, you know, maybe that's just a few more $1 million on your payroll, which you might find it's easy to absorb. Now, of course, there are some companies that are thought to not be so friendly towards these initiatives. And if you look at, for example, what happened with Twitter recently, where a lot of the hirings that were let go were
75%.
essentially it would seem were just ESG hires.
75%
because
were let go.
Because from what I can tell, the app is still operating and still running normally. Arguably better in some cases.
Yeah, and they have started hiring.
And they've which means that for the I think Twitter came into existence in, was it 2006 or 2009, somewhere there.
Yes.
And I'm meant to understand that in the almost 12 or so years, or almost 15 years in which they've been in existence, they've only ever broken even once. In 2014, I believe, is when they broke even for the first time, meaning they've been relying on investment capital to pay all of their bills. And of course, that capital was continuously flowing because they were saying, all right, we are starting a a new program for minorities, a new program for women, a new program for the environment. And so the investment cash probably just kept pouring in. And it didn't matter that they weren't making a profit, let alone breaking even. But now that there's a new boss in town, he's like,
Yeah.
this thing has to make money.
Yeah, I think what happened previously, we especially in the tech industry, was an avalanche of funds to fund any interesting projects that were out there.
Right.
So they were really flooded with funds, and the luxury that almost all tech companies enjoyed was overhiring. I think one of the greatest metrics any of them had to market themselves was the number of people they employed. It was one of the most prominent issues they would put forward. That we have so many people under all 100,000, 50,000, or whatever.
And they tended to emphasize their hiring choices, especially from a demographic standpoint.
Yes,
we have more blacks, we have more gays, we have more women, we have more this.
Yes, but that was during the period of quantitative easing, and we would call it easy money. With the tight situation that has occurred lately, from last year and on, the Elon Musk has been a real lightning rod for many of them. Even Facebook has been cutting, Google has cut. Everyone is going into cost cutting, and especially focusing on the overhead, focusing on the workforce, which tells you they were all holding a large chunk of workers for the prominence
now,
with which
brings me to the question of, surely at some point the rubber must meet the road. Like, we can sit here, or people can sit in an office and have lofty ideals about how the environment should be, how much representation and diversity there should be. But at the end of the day, it's the balance sheet that's going to matter, right? Yes. And however much free money you have to play around with, at some point the chickens have to come home to roost.
Yes.
Do you not think it's a potential bubble that can burst, where there could come a time in future where the companies that are most compliant with these initiatives start to suffer financially, which then might scare investors? Now, seeing as it so happens that the largest asset portfolio holders seem to be very much the ones pushing these initiatives, I'm wondering where the pressure could potentially come from in the opposite direction.
And the pushback are those particular owner investors, Elon Musk type, who have really started going into that direction of indicating, okay, we are going to focus on the real fundamentals. We are not going to start really putting all this fluffy stuff all around and really forget about what is we really need to do. So when he comes in and indicates that, okay, it's only people who are important, you have to show your importance or else we'll let go. Then I think other companies have woken up to that possibility as one of the areas, because it seems previously any particular company, prominent for that matter, that tried to go in that direction would suffer an avalanche of litigation, and that kind of made many of that particular grant.
So it forced everyone in line. So it needed an Elon Musk
something
to be the one to start to raise some or make some noise about this.
Yes. But ultimately, what is also happening is that the litigation is actually going on. I think the Me Too movement was quite prominent in starting or initiating some of these ideas. Black Lives Matter actually also brought some of the things to the forefront that investors, now when investors are the ones on the board pushing for this to be metrics within their risk analysis, then you cannot necessarily just walk away from them. Because some of the investors that have been prominent in this, there's this Chamath, he's a Sri Lankan billionaire, Facebook billionaire, who had set up company SPACs that were specific in their impact investment. They were focusing on technology or environment or investments in that line, and they had to meet particular metrics for them to participate, to receive funds from him.
Right.
Yeah. Now, with that particular idea, if funds are going to come in with a particular light or of a particular hue, and that's where LGB issues come in. If there are prominent billionaires who are inclined towards that particular lifestyle and they're investing, you basically have to find a way of meeting their criteria. It's their money.
Okay, so
that can be understandable to a certain extent.
Let me bring your attention to a recent controversy that unfolded in the United States regarding a certain trans woman who was hired to be a spokesperson or an influencer for a beer company called Bud Light. I think the company is called Anheuser-Busch. They own a brand called Bud Light.
Yes.
And they got a very, let's just say, a very charismatic, animated, but perhaps equally obnoxious person, extroverted person who was a man, I guess still is, although now identifies as female and so on and so forth.
Trans.
So this person has a huge following on social media, and the marketing department at Budweiser hired this person to be an influencer. And it's provoked a severe backlash that caused Anheuser-Busch to lose, I think, about $2.8 billion in its valuation, because there was a massive boycott that was initiated by the conservatives who were just saying, don't drink this beer, this company is woke, don't drink their beer, don't drink their beer. And it's the first time I've really ever seen a successful consumer boycott of a product that severely hit the wallet of of a major company,
going against woke.
Right. So I'm sure that Anheuser-Busch or Budweiser or whoever was in charge of making that decision, we're thinking in terms of these initiatives of diversity and inclusion and so on and so forth, and perhaps that did help them incur some of the benefits of the ESG stuff. But now that it has cost them severely, do you think if consumers generally now feel more emboldened to take action against companies that they feel are sending out messages counter to their values, and which values would be against those pushed by ESG, isn't there potential for ESG to crash or to become severely compromised? Because the next time a company pushes out a very overtly, say, progressive position, and let's say they decide to be pro-life on the issue of pro-choice, or maybe they put Black Lives Matter, or they put, who knows when the next boycott could hit and cause them also huge losses. What do you think about that?
Yes, ultimately, how a Budweiser, a beer, can drift into that kind of insecurity is really...
They dived into the cultural debate, and they paid a heavy price.
Really, that's unnecessary. And I think they should wake up to some of these things.
But it's unavoidable. If they're trying to be ESG compliant, they're going to continuously be pushed in that direction.
Yeah, and that's where a particular report I came across that indicated specific real technical studies of ESG pushing companies as compared to those that are just focused on the fundamentals. And ultimately, there is nothing that the ESG companies have actually done. Their returns are not in any case higher to begin with. They are not in any case pushing ESG related issues to the extent that they kind of market themselves to be doing.
Okay.
And as you indicated earlier, they are actually doing more of a marketing ploy than they are doing fundamental issues on ESG. And I think without proper metrics that one can put down and know that, okay, on this area, this company needs to do 3 or 4, like have real metrics on it, then what is being done, if it's all subjective, will not be as helpful.
I guess my final question to you would be, do you believe that companies that comply with these initiatives are likely to be more profitable in future?
So far, all studies have indicated that's not the case. They are not necessarily more profitable. What instead they are trying to indicate as far more important is that they are creating a better society, rather than just focusing on the bottom line.
Yeah, but if I'm a shareholder, if I own stock in, say, Disney, and I did hear a conversation between the CEO of Disney and one disgruntled shareholder, because it's a publicly traded company. Anyone can own shares in it. Okay, so he called in to a dialogue they were having with shareholders, and he said, hey, as a shareholder, I don't like that you guys are moving in this direction. I don't like that you're supporting LGBT, this and that. I don't like that, because I think in the case of Disney, there was a controversy they got into with the state of Florida.
Yes.
Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
I think the state of Florida, the controversy had to do with something they were calling the, what was it? Don't say gay. That was, the controversy was ascribed that name. The don't say gay or something like that. Or if, unless I'm mistaken, I think that was it. So the idea had to do with some sort of limitation the state of Florida wanted to impose on some LGBT issues, to which a representative from Disney, actually Disney itself, came out against that initiative. So it put itself at war with the state.
The state governor was very, very, very aggressive. Don Santos was very aggressive.
Right. And so this caused a big stink. And then obviously, from a entertainment perspective, Disney has lately been criticized for forced diversity. There's a film called The Little Mermaid, the live action remake, previously played by previously had a white leading character,
as always, and
in this new live version they made it a black woman.
Yes, they did.
And so these sorts of things which this push for diversity in a lot of their entertainment products, in TV shows and movies and other things, sort of seems to be rubbing some of their shareholders the wrong way. So could a shareholder revolt potentially put a halt to some of these initiatives?
Often shareholders, and we indicated earlier, the real prominent ones seem to be pushing. Why they are pushing is because they are worried about litigation and what will come out of that, and they see that overall their portfolio will suffer. The smaller shareholders could do a class action, and in most cases, when some of the things are reversed, they are reversed in court, often, or they pocket. And so either way, whatever touches the pockets is what can cause a reversal to a particular push, especially these things that are seem more social than otherwise. And that being what it has been so far, you find that the prominent companies are now really focused on what? On it because of litigation. The public space is, to me, what has been of interest specifically, especially Hollywood. You see, Hollywood has pushed that agenda. I don't think there is a movie that is prominent today that does not have a particular agenda.
Right. There's a lot of wokeness in it, in the movies these days.
Yeah. But to me, I think Hollywood is a particular class and a social space that has prominence with some of these players. And I don't really have a problem with people living their lives, even if they may throw it into our faces. If it's their private lives, that's it. I don't mind that. The same thing happens with fashion. I don't think a person goes into fashion and then you bring a conservative outlook. You won't succeed.
Probably not. You have to be... I think, and this is... has been the biggest issue, is that it would just seem that a more liberal mindset lends itself to more creative, artistic creativity.
Yes. And so in those spaces, I don't think there is a particular problem with particular agendas being pushed. It's when you go into spaces like beer. Really?
Something that has a more mass appeal across a larger potential customer base.
Exactly.
Where you are likely to run into people whose cultural values may run counter.
That's very true.
To those of the people you're trying to impress.
Yeah, then you cannot crush people's sensibilities by insisting on your own as the most important. If everyone is being private about what they do, it doesn't hurt following suit.
This is so interesting. But I guess a lot of these companies can't really help themselves. So my final question is now, in your opinion, what are the future trends and challenges we can anticipate in the realm of ESG, and how do you think they will impact the global economy and financial markets?
To me, ESG is the latest fad. I think I'm considering it as a fad that is becoming prominent, but it has also gone into private area, public companies, and everywhere else. I believe, like we had Millennium Development Goals, we had SDGs, we have now what we are considering. There was a corporate social responsibility. Now we have ESG. Now, unless there are particular metrics, because when you talk of ESG on the African continent, I think South Africa is one of the most prominent in pushing inclusivity, especially after blacks came into power.
That is so true. And in fact, the reason I felt prompted to discuss this topic was that I was watching an advert on YouTube. It just sort of popped up of the Stanbic Bank CEO of South Africa. And I think he was just giving a report to the stakeholders and shareholders. And in his remarks, he said, ESG, we are compliant with ESG of all these goals. And I'm like, oh, wait, this is also in Africa now?
Yes. No, South Africa has been, from the time ANC came into power, what you consider BEE is basically Black Economic Empowerment.
Yes.
It has been what you'd consider ESG.
All right.
And that one has metrics, at least. I think on issues like gay marriage, on issues like, I think anyone who wants to have freedom in those specific areas just goes to South Africa and marries, and they've been doing it long before even it was in the US. So, and then when you talk of BE, you talk of even carbon-related environmental issues. I think South Africa has done. I believe those who may need to have proper metrics and frameworks around this would have to look to South Africa. But then there's a cautionary tale.
What's that?
Where is South Africa headed with this particular? Are some of these issues? Because ultimately in South Africa, criminals survive because of the liberal attitude. The government, there is a lot of push. Of course, it's a very deep and controversial area, but there is a certain, not relaxed, but acceptance of a particular danger within society that they know is because of the previous history, so that they have a certain prominence.
So you think they're kind of overcompensating for the injustices of apartheid, to where they're not really keeping an eye on how far things are going in the wrong direction?
For South Africa, apartheid suppressed one group of people, the majority, to such an extent that for the first time being released from all this, they all just, should I say, exploded all over the place. Now, when they are all over the place, even a government cannot necessarily push back the genie into the bottle. People have that freedom, and some have not been allowed development to the levels that would have helped them survive in a free world.
So this is quite interesting because for most of this conversation, you've maintained a mostly optimistic outlook towards ESG, whereas now you sound almost like you're not sure.
Yes, to me, I think lumping all of them together is not helpful. I mean, it is just too wide an area. You cannot have environment and have social and have governance all lumped into one and get a proper metric that can help you. Some of the things have to be looked at individually, and where metrics can be developed, because I've seen some PhD studies that are coming up, and people are trying to find ways of incorporating or generating metrics that can be helpful in the accounting part of businesses.
Okay.
Yeah, so you can see where there can be hope with metrics, but where there's something is amorphous and it's subjective and it's political, I know it becomes a huge problem. Because I mean, they'll have, it will be a question of perspectives and the relativity. So each side can push its agenda and insist, well, what you're pushing does not apply. While in accounting, you know very well.
Obviously.
You know what you're dealing with. You know the only issues you'll either cry about is whether there's profitability or not.
That's all that matters.
That's it.
Well, it seems like we've only begun to scratch the surface of this thing. I think it's a multi-layered topic, and perhaps we can revisit the issue in future and see what other angles we can look at it from.
Yes.
Otherwise, I do want to thank you so much, Mr. Wotsomu Wanda, economic analyst and consultant, joining us once again on the Fatboy Show to discuss ESG. Maybe you can let people know where they can find you.
Yes, people can find me Wotsomu Wanda on most of the platforms. Twitter, you can find me on Facebook, you can find me on TikTok. I'm generating a little activity there. And then, yes, I'm also running my Substack. So if I get emails, you can always get a newsletter from me.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, and how do they access that?
Yeah, you need to drop me your email. You capture my email, I think send me, or I capture yours, ultimately, that's it. So I'm undawa01@gmail.com.
All right. And in case you're watching this on YouTube, you'll probably see it displayed on the screens.
Yes, sir.
Well, while ESG, or environment, social, and governance, has emerged as a powerful framework for promoting sustainable and responsible business practices, it is crucial to recognize its potential dangers. The lack of standardization, subjective judgments, and lack of data reliability, as Wotsomu Wanda was telling us, poses significant challenges. And then there's the risk of tokenism and resentment and unintended bias, the stifling of free speech that can emerge as negative consequences of the diversity initiatives that we talked about. Genuine inclusion, comprehensive approaches to diversity, and a focus on merit-based evaluations are essential. And as we navigate the evolving landscape of ESG, and as more companies seek to adopt it, or perhaps I should instead say, as more companies are forced, in quotes, to adopt it by the likes of Blackrock and Vanguard, it remains to be seen if the pursuit of sustainable and responsible practices as envisaged by the promoters of ESG leads to meaningful and equitable outcomes for all stakeholders involved. Or maybe it will just pave the way to a dystopian future. There's that too. You never know. You're listening to The Fatboy Show, your number one station, RX Radio.